Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
It's not whether you win, but how you play the game. Well, that's an adage that for most things is true, but not necessarily for modern politics. It seems that innuendo, lies, October surprises, and political dirt are the order of the day, and all that matters is securing the seat. But does that mean that fair play is a thing of the past? Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's action-packed show, we're examining why progressivism and democracy just don't mix, ask who fact-checks the fact-checkers, delve deep into the new Supreme Court term, and a whole lot more. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Hastings, Michigan on WBCH 1220 AM and 93.1 FM. Thanks for being here. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Sometimes two substances just don't mix. Oil and water, chalk and cheese, and yes, progressivism and democracy. What makes these two political factions mutually exclusive? Well, to figure that out, we're joined by senior political analyst for LibertyNation.com and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Welcome back, Tim.
Hello, Mark.
So, Tim, you wrote an article on LibertyNation.com that I loved, that I recommend everybody go and read. It's a real tour de force of political thinking and analysis, and it explained why progressivism is antithetical to democracy. Can you give us a broad strokes on this, please?
Well, when I was writing the article that went on LibertyNation.com, Democracy, Progressivism, a Contradiction in Terms, I was considering the title Oil and Water, honestly, because as much as they proclaim, without investigation by the elite media, of course, they just let these things stand unchallenged. They're calling now Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans and maybe conservatives in general a threat to democracy. Well, they don't say a threat to the republic. Notice that they do not say a threat to the republic, even though we are a constitutional republic. The reason that progressivism and democracy are antithetical is because progressivism relies on command and control from the largest possible central state that they can assemble, depending on the extent to which they can get voters to go along with their agenda. But to suggest that their style of governance is democracy, first of all, we're not a democracy. We have to go over this over and over, Mark. We're not a democracy. We're a constitutional republic. We don't have a winner-take-all mentality where 50% plus one means that we can tyrannize the minority. We have minority protection.
Let's just point out the funness of that particular fact there, Tim. We don't have the tyranny of the 50 plus one. Now, a lot of people might be thinking, well, that plus one there, isn't that Kamala Harris? And they're really trying to put in a sweeping agenda of legislation, the Democrats at the moment, where they do have, as you point out, only the 50 plus one. And it's not even she's not elected president of the Senate per se. It comes with the job title of vice president. So it's not even a real majority in those terms, is it?
Well, I think the progressives really unmasked themselves when they essentially lost seats in the House, barely control the Senate with a 50-50 because of Kamala Harris. And they did win the presidency in a bizarre year that was marked by a pandemic and unbridled violence in urban areas across the country. But they took that very thin mandate and turned it into a sweeping refiguring, recalculating of the entire system of governance. They wanted to add justices to the Supreme Court so they could have a permanent majority there. They wanted to add states so that, liberal areas such as Puerto Rico and Guam would become states and add two more Democratic votes in the Senate each so that they'd have essentially a permanent majority there. And then they would not have to rely on the will of the people. Put simply, Mark, I think that they embrace so-called democracy over a republic because essentially they've been unable to convince any significant portion of the American people that things like defunding the police and passing $6 trillion in new spending with inflation running at the highest rate in 40 years and a $30 trillion deficit. That's the kind of thing an autocratic movement would do because they don't care about the will of the people. They only care about pressing their socialist agenda, no matter what it takes.
Yeah, I think too many people don't really understand the inherent threats within a pure democracy. I mean, sure, it's been described many times as rule by the mob, but on a deeper level, a pure democracy, I think would cause two major issues in the modern world. The first being that there would be literally no political stability, and it would swing from one extreme to the other every election cycle, which obviously we saw this. Well, we saw back in Rome before it became an empire. The populists the populist families, they'd elevate their populist leader sons within the family who would become the lightning rods for all of the woes of the Roman people. And they'd get all this support. But then once they were the populists in charge, then the people on the outside would then say, hey, we're the new populists. Yes, and it would swing from one extreme to the other. But the second point is that the nation would essentially become unbearable, unlivable every 4 years for roughly half the population.
Right.
But isn't that almost what we're seeing now? Aren't we living through that right now?
Well, we are because of the balkanization of the electorate, essentially. You've got two people living, as I wrote in another article on Liberty Nation, living on different planets. You tune into MSNBC or CNN the way it used to be before they started firing everybody. And their whole world is about catastrophic climate change and January 6th and raising taxes for more of their social schemes. It's an entirely different world than you see when you go on Fox News, for example, and you see a country riven by a border crisis, by urban crime, by rising inflation, cost of living, all of that stuff. So we're so balkanized now. But the point is more that the claim that the left are the guardians of democracy is a cruel joke because they're anything but small d Democrats.
Yeah, I see exactly where you're coming from there, Tim. I have one final question for you, if I may. Now, with the left so keen to shy away and even just gloss over the fact that the United States is a constitutional republic, is the end game for it not to be a constitutional republic? And will that ever be achieved?
Certainly that's their goal. I wrote another piece saying the left finally admits...
The prolific writer, Mr.
Yes,
Tim Donner.
The left finally admits that they want to get rid of the Constitution. And the reason is because they can't get rid of that pesky First Amendment, which refuses to outlaw hate speech. They can't get rid of that pesky Second Amendment, which provides for self-defense of the citizens. They cannot get rid of the things they don't like, which stand in the way of their command and control of the entire system. So they prefer to call for a democracy as if that's what they really are all about. Joe Biden does it, everyone down the line does it, and an uncritical media allows them to get away with it. Well, at libertynation.com, we don't let them get away with that claim.
And that's some good words to leave it on. Tim Donner, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
Later in the show, we have a special Supreme Court rundown. But up next, after this short break, we figure out who controls the media narrative and why the GOP is party non grata. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
When fact checkers only work for one side of the aisle, how much faith can the public have in its institutions? With news that a supposedly bipartisan group was responsible for flagging what they call falsehoods, at the behest of just one party, I might add, the narrative tends to crumble. Now, someone who's been delving deep into this particular morass is Liberty Nation's national columnist, Sarah Cowgill, who joins us here today. Thanks for being here, Sarah.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here, Mark. It's a sticky subject.
It is. It's such an odd topic, especially once we get into the details, which are coming up right now. So there's a group called the Election Integrity Project. What's their role?
Well, they popped up right prior to the 2020 election, and their whole job was to, make sure that any kind of misinformation or outright lies or things that could be fact checked regarding the candidates and the issues and all of the drama that surrounded 2020 could be put into a category of either it's true, go ahead and let the big tech media platforms publish, or not. That's basically it in a nutshell.
Okay, and this group, the Election Integrity Project, is made up of whom?
Well, lots of liberal institutions, and
what a shock!
Me, but I'm gonna have to read them to you.
Absolutely.
The Stanford Internet Observatory, the University of Washington, the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, and social media analytics firm Graphica. These are all very well known, very liberal-oriented, progressive-oriented type of organizations.
So what they essentially did was they had outside groups send them messages that they'd come across on social media or websites, for example. And then this group, the Election Integrity Project, they would then call that a ticket and then put that ticket towards the big tech platforms. Is that right?
That is correct. It's a very simple process if you are allowed to submit a ticket. Basically, all you do is write out, show the information, tell people where it's at, the Election Integrity Project, tell the people where it is, maybe just post a link. And then the Election Integrity Project takes that and analyzes it, and then, basically goes to the big tech people and tells them not to publish.
Now, they've had the Election Integrity Project, it's had quite good success. Well, let's not use the term good on that. Let's not use that particular adjective, but it has
been
quite
very
some
successful.
Success. And what are the numbers on that?
Well, and again,
please feel free to reference.
I don't like math so much, and I don't memorize numbers unless it's whatever's in my bank account or my pocket.
That's the one.
Let's see. In there, and this was I pulled this right out of their annual report, project report after the election. It was published in 2021. They had a 35% success rate influencing tech platforms to restrict content or slap a label on the post. All those, pop-up ads that say, go see this about your vaccination, or, they give you options and tell you that the post is misleading or outright lie. And then they also, in the report, boast that Twitter, Google, Facebook, and TikTok all had 75% or higher response rate on EIP ticketing, which means that they went, yeah, we can remove that. Whatever, 75% out of 100% of complaints is a pretty high number.
Some would say that's almost 3/4.
Some would say that is almost exactly 3/4. Thank you for making that more simple, Mark.
You're very welcome. Now, here's the thing that really got me on this, Sarah. You wrote in an article for this on libertynation.com, and you explained who had the ability to raise complaints to the Election Integrity Project, which they would then action. Now, you mentioned certain federal agencies that had access to this, but you also said that the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, had the right to raise complaints. Now, here's the question that I know that everybody is wanting answered. Was this service offered to the Republican National Committee also?
I have absolutely no idea,
Okay.
but going out on a limb, I would say no. Otherwise, who wouldn't take up that opportunity to try to, balance the equation here? If I was head of the RNC, I would have demanded it, but I'm not sure too many people knew that this was even going on.
So this is likely something that the RNC was not even aware of and therefore couldn't use. So does that strike you as something that would be classed as bipartisan in your political analysis?
I would say it is extremely partisan. There wasn't anything bipartisan about this. If you look at it, you had Homeland Security and the State Department. And okay, they're going to cover their hind ends when it comes to all sorts of stuff. So yeah, we understand that there are some certain government agencies that will do that, but also the under agencies had access as well. And then when you look at the DNC and the NAACP, and who was the other? Okay, again, I'm cheating. Common Cause.
Common Cause.
Those are hardcore progressive left agencies, organizations, and they had access. So I don't see anything on here that would allow for a conservative counterbalance.
Okay, and how do you think this impacts people's trust in these big social media sites, these big internet giants, in terms of public trust?
Well, if the word gets out, it could influence public trust. But think about how many people have watched the untruths unspool in some of our major dailies and on some of our network television stations. They feel that it's okay to go ahead and report and then maybe apologize later if they have to. But, you can't unring a bell. And this is what has happened. What I see on social media is that, the conservative groups and the liberal groups, both, if it's something that they don't believe, they don't care. They just scroll past or they block or they move on. So I don't think it's really going to have that big of an influence unless it makes a major splash on all major cable news networks and television networks.
As the saying goes, a lie travels halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. Sarah Calgary, I want to thank you ever so much for being here. Really, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Mark.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. Later in the show, we're talking liberty, but as a special treat, Scott D. Cosenza joined us early to discuss the latest Supreme Court term. Don't touch that dial. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The Supreme Court is off to the races with a brand new term and even a new face. What are the big cases to watch this year, and will this season be as politically contentious as the last? Well, we've asked Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, host of the Uprising podcast, and general fount of knowledge on all things constitutional, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, to join us for a special segment examining the big SCOTUS cases. Thanks for coming in, Scott.
Cheers, Mark.
So, Scott, last session we saw gun rights strongly reiterated via Bruin versus New York State Rifle and Pistol Association. We also saw Roe v. Wade sent back to the states. Now, both of these have had and are having huge implications for politics in America. Are there any cases coming up in this brand new session of a similar magnitude?
Well, I think guns and abortion are probably, I don't think it does get bigger than that.
So the second season's not as good as the first.
Well,
it's the way of all television shows
no.
And Supreme Court terms,
almost
right?
all. There are the exceptions to the rule. Narcos, I think, is one perhaps, and there may be others out there. There are, affirmative action in higher education and perhaps writ large affirmative action in other places is potentially on the chopping block. The affirmative action in higher education is definitely up before the court. What I mean is, could that expand out and, in fact, be as impactful as the gun cases or the abortion cases? Perhaps, Mark. If the Supreme Court decides finally to end racial segregation, quote unquote, a positive racial segregation and discrimination. So right now, you're not allowed to discriminate against a person of color in favor of, for instance, white people, but you're absolutely able to discriminate against whites and especially Asians in the higher education example in favor of black and brown people.
So what is the case here that's before the court? Is it's the universities representing Asian students, right? Asian American students?
Yeah, well, it's just about whether or not they can use race to discriminate in a positive way to kind of buoy the fortunes of, black and brown people who would go to a really great, perhaps non-elite college. That's sort of a joke because, it's not like there's somebody who's never getting a chance in life who, is being elevated to, high-end status. It's people are basically just elevated one level or so above of where they might be in any case.
Okay, what's the name of this case that we're looking at?
There are two cases consolidated on the affirmative action case. One is out of North Carolina and one is out of Harvard. And the reason why they kind of took both and so they combined them and then split them. And the reason is it's a function of Ketanji Brown Jackson being a Harvard director of sorts. I forget what program she was a director of, but she would have a conflict of interest if it was the Harvard case. But even though the identical issue is presented in another case, she can rule on that without the conflict being present. And so it's sort of a trick of wording rather than anything,
It's an illusion, not a trick.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Scott, if the court rules, how would they rule that essentially affirmative action for positive discrimination is at an end? How could that manifest
It's difficult for me to describe without kind of sounding perhaps contemptuous or unappreciative of the nuance of the liberals' argument. But essentially, they argue that even though the law, the Civil Rights Act of all our civil rights acts that prevent discrimination on the basis of race don't say, but it's okay if you want to remediate earlier discrimination by now discriminating against somebody who you think it's okay to discriminate. They don't say those things. That's just an invented law by the justices on the Supreme Court who have said that, and especially this is the case in higher education, it's perfectly
You're talking
fine.
about previous justices on the Supreme Court in earlier cases, right?
That's exactly right.
Yep.
Excuse me. So the Supreme Court case we're talking about now that's going to be heard has not yet been presented for oral argument before the court. But previous affirmative action cases, when they were ruled upon, the court basically said it's okay to discriminate against whites and Asians. It's okay to discriminate in favor of preferred black and brown people against those other and use race as a basis for that discrimination. They just say that it's okay because of it's redressing past discrimination. Now, why that makes it okay, Mark, in our constitutional scheme, even though it goes against the plain language of the Civil Rights Act, I don't understand it, but that is what our law is presently.
I think this is likely to be one of the most contentious cases of the decade, really, Scott, because it's the kind of thing that people will talk about. I believe in America you say around the office water cooler, if they dare speak about it at all. In that
there you go,
case.
right?
So because I think it Sandra Day O'Connor who
it is. I know where you're going, and that's perfectly
who
right
said
quote.
that there should be. I don't remember the exact quote here, but it's essentially that at some point affirmative action will have to stop because the redress will have been redressed. The wrongs will have been redressed.
She mused that, perhaps in 25 years, we could readdress the issue of allowing discrimination against unfavored races, and now mostly that's whites and Asians, and in favor of, favored races. And she then actually went on after her term as a justice and made sure to qualify that to say 25 was just the soonest time when I thought that would take place. Let's not get ahead of ourselves and think it might even be quicker than that,
Might even be quicker. Let's just put this in perspective. How long ago did she say this?
Mark, that was in 2003 in the Grutter v. Bollinger case.
Okay, so we still got 6 years, according to her template, for this to carry on.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Absolutely. Let's not get too far ahead.
There are many Asians who need to be discriminated against in the meantime.
Well, so here's the thing with this particular form of positive discrimination, as they call it. People are being shuffled, and it's not as though somebody with no chance of going to university is now getting a place at one of the top Ivy League schools. It's a question of them going up one layer, as it were. So it's a very good school to an Ivy League school. But what happens to the students who are denied a place based on their work ethic, their past performance in different exams? Now, surely they're going one echelon down. Now, does that impact them financially, for their life chances, for their children's life chances? Presumably it would.
Absolutely it does. It does in, I'm kind of an expert about it just in the sense of law school, being a person who's attended it and looked at the different salary projections, and the people who graduate from the elite schools make a lot more money than the people who don't graduate from the elite schools, as you might imagine. It stands to reason this would be true for other disciplines as well. And the mass of people that are being pushed out of the elite, they are, they're really suffering. And, it's funny because you talked about how this often basically elevates people to sort of like one level, right? Well, I think that's probably true for the middling section, but for the elite, it's probably the most skewed. And what I mean by that is at the lower level, somebody maybe wouldn't get into college at all, who's now at a community college, there wasn't that much of a boost up for a person like that. But to get the sufficient quantity of the highly desirous, you can just think of a person who is a Black female in a engineering program. Okay. The vacuum that engineering program has for Black or trans women of color. Okay. There are almost none. It's first of all, it's mostly male, and it skews, Asian, the engineering, and maths. Right. And it's like the farthest away you get from that demographically. So the more you get female, and then the more you get into persons of color, the fewer applicants there are naturally for those positions. So there's a greater vacuum pull then to lift people up from the unqualified ranks. Let's recall that that's what this is about. It's about people who otherwise do not qualify for the position except for the color of their skin. And so I think it also robs us, Mark, finally, of having the best people be pushed to create their best. Society really does benefit from this.
Well, it's not as though it's happening in medical school, is it, Scott?
Yeah, right.
Oh, hang on. Now, obviously, I know you hate to get out your crystal ball on this, Scott, because there's no way to really tell, right? They haven't heard arguments. We don't know where people are going to jump. But have any of the justices on the bench ever made comments that would indicate that they're willing to go one way or the other?
Oh, well, yes. Mark, Justice Thomas was on the bench in the Bollinger case where Sandra Day O'Connor lectured him that they would just need 25 more years to discriminate in favor of Blacks.
25 years to flatten the curve, right?
He disagreed then, and presumably he will disagree again. And, for the crystal ball status, some cases are sort of easier than others to sort of predict. And I do predict that really all the conservative justices are with the person. And Roberts, let's say it's a 5 to 4 to 1, or excuse me, 5 to 3 to 1 court. And what I mean by that is 5 conservative justices, 3 lefty justices, and Justice Roberts on the end there. So, but I believe there will be 5 votes to overturn it, and I think that's going to be great that people aren't judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. Something that I was, obviously taught by liberals.
Absolutely. Now, coming up after this short break, we're back with Scott discussing the other big stories of the week that impact your rights and your liberties. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Scott D. Cosenza. Earlier we discussed the fresh term at the Supreme Court and what to expect in the big affirmative action case. But now I want to look at what other cases are before the Supreme Court. What can we expect out of there, Scott?
Well, just this week was a major case regarding land regulation in the United States and another one regarding voting rights. The land use case has to deal with a major power grab to regulate lots of land in the United States as wetlands when it might just be, wet after a rainy season.
Now, Scott, I've read your article on this on the pages of libertynation.com. So for those of our listeners thinking, what is this about? This is as dry as desert or as wet as swamp water, but it's actually got some quite far-reaching ramifications. What are those, Scott?
The ramifications are whether or not the Environmental Protection Agency has the authority to regulate almost all building or development on much land in the United States of America. And the idea is, did Congress contemplate giving them that power? And if so, was it legal or did they not? And it all depends on the definitions of a few words in what I think that a lot of people would say is an act that was drafted without the necessary degree of precision that it should have been, which is the Clean Water Act.
Okay, so what it means is that the EPA could designate a certain area of land, even if it's not on a wetland area, but if it has a tributary going through it, or it sits.
No, let me just stop you there, Mark, because that's more direct than what they're arguing. The EPA is arguing that really much more tangential contact or no contact at all, but just nearby or adjacent contact from one land to another that is then adjacent to a navigable waterway would trigger the ability for the EPA to regulate that land. And by regulate, I mean come in and say you can't build the house that the land you bought to build on, which was zoned by the local governance as buildable, had a building permit issued by the state government, but the EPA wants to regulate you and is charging you basically up to $40,000 a day in fines if you don't do what they like. So it's a catastrophic experience for Americans who run up against, this kind of regulation. And it wasn't like this was like poisoning some aquifer. They didn't want to put like a chemical factory on some pristine wilderness. Just somebody wanted to build on their land, some acreage that they bought, again, which was zoned for it. It will fundamentally change many Americans' lives and make their property worthless if the EPA can claim regulatory purchase on their land.
Now, I want to go a little bit further, which is perhaps beyond the realms of just a legal discussion on this, Scott. But if the EPA manages to do this and is not held back by the Supreme Court judgment, what effect will this have on land prices?
Well, they're not going to increase, that's for sure. One of the big criticisms is that because of the way that the EPA would have the regulation be interpreted with some vague nexus, there's some vague nexus kind of woo-woo argument about what constitutes
That's a legal term for our listeners, by the way, woo-woo nexus.
Basically what would have to happen is every landowner or prospective landowner, because that's what you're contemplating in terms of the market, would have to go to the EPA and say, can you tell me, is this a wetland or not? As you might imagine, Mark, that would not be an inexpensive process. It's not like there's some quick, well-attended toll-free number for people to call and say, hey, can you tell me about this property? And they say, here you go. Absolutely not. It's hugely costly. And if you're wrong and you go ahead anyway, well, the consequences can be devastating.
$40,000 a day. And of course, there is the fact that waterways change over time. So something that
Okay.
isn't regulated
so you're
now.
1,000% right. Waterways do change over time, but I just want to stop you right there because we're not talking about a waterway at all. We're not even talking about a wetland.
No, of course, but that would impact the areas that are tangential to.
Sometimes during the year and is sometimes dry. And if you just took a look at it, you would never think this was a marsh or there are fish or anything living there. It just looks like regular land. But you are right. Even very, major waterways like, significant rivers, they do change over time.
So Scott, another one I want to delve into, maybe make this our last case for the week, because I think it's one of the most newsworthy ones, and certainly an interesting one as far as I'm concerned, is Donald Trump has made an appeal to the Supreme Court, specifically out of the 11th Circuit. Could you give us the details?
An emergency appeal, and Clarence Thomas is the justice who handles emergency appeals out of that circuit, and he has the capability of ruling on Donald Trump's appeal or passing it on to the full court. I'll say before I even discuss the facts, I expect he would pass it on to the full court for review. Trump says that the 11th Circuit committed a judicial error when it reviewed the lower court's order about a special master in the Mar-a-Lago search warrant documents case. So they seize all this stuff at Mar-a-Lago. Trump runs to federal court. He says, hey, wait a second. You should have taken a lot of this stuff, other stuff that you took. Maybe you could have it, but you can't use it against me to build a criminal case. The judge, Cannon, who was a Trump appointee, says, okay, we'll appoint a special master to review those claims, and then we'll shuffle the stuff to the DOJ if it passes muster, and if not, you'll get it back, basically. That's the nuts and bolts of it. DOJ doesn't like that. They run to the 11th Circuit and say, hey, we need this stuff to determine national security, blah, 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 and to continue to prosecute Trump and others for crimes. That court, with 2 Trump appointees on a 3-judge panel, by the way, rules, okay, fine, we're going to give the DOJ access to about 100 or so of these documents that were marked classified. Now Trump says even doing that prejudices him with respect to the criminal case, and it does so against all of the rules and procedures of the court, which is to say that decision by Cannon to implement the special master review process and how it was not appealable, and it was improper that the 11th Circuit heard that appeal and that how they ruled. And so it's not a question mark of, the merits of whether there was this privileged, argument, if it's granted or not. It has nothing to do with that. It's just about whether this type of ruling, whether it was okay for the court to rule on that at all at this stage. So that's what's presented to the Supreme Court.
And you suspect that Justice Thomas will push this up to the full court?
Yes, in spite of I wish he were somewhat more like the justice that's depicted on MSNBC and on Twitter, but he is a relatively conservative justice. I don't think it's it's not impossible that he would rule on it himself, but I think it's unlikely.
All right, Scott DiCrescenzo, we'll keep following this case on the pages of libertynation.com. Thank you ever so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's about all we have time for in this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I want to thank our guests, Tim Donner, Sarah Calgill, and Scott DiCrescenzo, and of course you at home for taking the time to join us. My parting shot for this week is a short and simple quote from Thomas Jefferson, who said, "Most bad government has grown out of too much government." Remember, when politicians ignore the idea of a constitutional republic in favor of their brand of democracy, they're not calling for more freedom, but rather for more government. And we all know where that leads. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe space.
You only did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.